Thank you very much. And our next and final speaker is Theodore Spyropoulos. Please help me welcome him.
I want to take the opportunity to thank Daniela for the kind invitation. And for me, I was quite pleased in Peter's response to the question that I asked regarding heroes, because I actually do feel in a certain way, knowing Peter a bit and knowing Patrick and having some exposure to them, in Peter's definition of being an educator was committed to basically working with people and expanding the field through knowledge is a very important thing that resonates very deeply with me. And having had the chance to actually work for Peter and to work for Patrick and Zaha, I learned some things. I can't say that I agreed with everything, but to be honest, it resonated very much with me because it evolved a kind of way of thinking about architecture which had to have a certain generosity and a commitment to the practice and the demands that that actually entails. And I believe education is really at the heart of that. So I don't build very much. I'm not really interested in money. But I do really believe in ideas, and I think it's very important to progress the kind of knowledge of architecture through open acts and frameworks that are very much trying to discover, to be curious, and to sort of set the stage of what it actually means to practice today. I titled the talk All is Behavior, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those thoughts that I actually have. It's kind of a play on, let's say, someone who was quite famous within the radical or so-called utopian architects of Hans Hollein, who recently passed away, who basically spoke about the fact that everything was architecture or all is architecture. Daniela asked if we could put a statement of purpose or a provocation, and honestly, for me, it sits both as a statement of purpose. I wrote, architecture today must participate and engage with the information rich environments that are shaping our lives by constructing frameworks that allow for change and embrace the unknown. Models of the past cannot operate as blueprints for our future. When science fiction has become fact, architecture today has to move beyond representation, beyond the fixed and finite tendencies that declare what architecture should be and work towards what it could be. In the context of the Biennale, which is part of the events that are about here, I'm not necessarily really sure what the state of architecture is, but I think it's kind of interesting for me. This is the first time that I've been in Chicago, and it's almost like a history book from Spyropoulos that I learned when I was in New Jersey about a history of a lot of people that participated in this city. And as a reflection on that, someone like me wrote and was quoted as saying, "It's not possible to go forward while looking back." If that's one history of architecture, and I think we're all in the business somehow of constructing a history that makes things more operational and intellectually starts to provoke what architecture could be, I also pose another figure in this kind of conversation that was working at IIT. His name was Hans Wein-Forrester, part of a group of thinkers, themed radical constructivists. He ran something called the Biological Computation Lab, and he wrote, "Objectivity is subject's delusion, that observing can be done without him. Involving objectivity is abrogating responsibility, hence its popularity." And he was part of a group of people that were trying to question the role of ecology, new sciences of thinking, of artificial intelligence, and so forth. And one of the problematizing aspects was the role of computation. My life is somehow split between two, I think, fields of teaching and trying to do things as a practitioner, but I would also thirdly say as a student of architecture. And part of that is my time that has evolved all of these practices after I was working for Peter, moving back to London at a school called the Architectural Association, and someone who recently passed away, James Gowan, put a book together about the history of architecture within the AA, and he called it a continuous experiment, which, like sculptors like Robert Morris, who was talking about the continuous project, Alter Daily, it's part of learning and teaching and also considering yourself as part of a much larger kind of cultural project. For me, what's important is making things accessible and shared, and I'll try to give try to situate what I mean through a kind of history of computation and participatory models, and at the same time try to give a little bit of legibility through my own work and the things that we actually do. So I am a believer in collective design, and I'm interested in educational frameworks, but I'm interested in them as being sort of not talking about an idea of the academic or the academia, but of really about bringing together people into a space where ideas actually matter. So for example, here's an image of John Fraser, Price, cybernetician Gordon Paskin, who should be here, is Joan Littlewood, who was basically the principal investigator of ideas that became the Fun Palace. And when we talk about utopia and we talk about experimentation, we have to talk about the ideas that this wasn't just visions for the sake of constructing visions or experiments for the sake of experimentation. The Metabolists had a certain form of this. This is Osaka Expo. Events like Biennales and all these kind of other opportunities for really architects to come together and to share and to create the discourse as much as to acknowledge others. So for example, this is an image at Osaka at the opening where you have people like Yona Friedman, Dennis Crompton from Archigram. You have other characters like Moshe Safdie, who became quite famous for some of the young architects here for just basically building his final thesis project, what became Habitat and what still serves as a very important project. So the notion of actually what practice means is something about a more profound and sincere relationship towards actually what our commitment to architecture is. At the same time, I try to situate and construct a history of computation, because I think at some moment it seems like everybody is very assured about what it means, but it has a deep history. And it's a history that I would say is evolving from the 50s till today. And moments of that, or the dematerialization of architecture, could be looked at as, for example, Negroponte, when he was a young graduate, set up something called the Architecture Machine Group at MIT, a 10-year experiment that actually turned and morphed into something else, what we know now as the MIT Media Lab, which he served as the first director. So for me, architecturally, fundamentally, is about asking questions and asking ways to ask more informed questions about not necessarily just the novelty of today, but actually the pursuit of where these kind of thought experiments could be. So for me, the role of design today is collective, and it's shared, and it's one of action and awareness, and it challenges this kind of certainty of command and control, which very much a part of a certain kind of discourse of people working through technology without necessarily having direct access to it. I also think computation is evolving, and through that we start to reemerge certain people that were working, for example, constructing learning environments like Seymour Papert, who was one of the founders of the AI lab at MIT. We start to also maybe potentially reconsider certain forms of practices as a form of serious play. If we look at the Eames and how they structure things, the idea of certain limits and constraints didn't necessarily kind of constrain the vision of actually what was being discussed. This is a boom that's attached to just an everyday truck. This was basically the setup for Powers of 10. In London, it's quite common to talk at the Architectural Association about technology. We have people that are for it, against it, and so on and so forth, symptomatic of pretty much everything. But we had a figure there named Cedric Price who basically stated technology is the answer. But he followed that up, what was the question? And so for me, I think in the context of how I work, I'll just give you a little bit of an overview of the things that occupy my life. The Design Research Lab, which I get the chance to work with Patrick, is basically an open framework where kids come, completely international, different stages in their life, to work together. Though we have, I think, certain approaches and ideas, and we can agree to disagree and so on and so forth, it is a space of respect with which one can sort of interrogate those kind of ideas together. It is a space that's also very open. As a public charity, the AA basically stays as an institution that's really funded by the fact that everyone is a participant. And if we take, let's say, Cedric Price as an example, everyone is also a performer in that. So we sort of construct projects when we have the opportunity to do that with students, trying to test certain assumptions, and also to understand the fact that not everything is possible. And actually deep-rooted sort of attitudes towards design need and necessitate a commitment to make those things realized. The other half of my, let's say, being, I guess, within the idea of design is a small practice that I opened up with my brother. You want to call it a family business that doesn't really think about business very well, if you ask my accountant. We set up something called Minima Forms, which was really a platform for us to sort of work and to sort of try to work through different things that I learned from other people, that I was learning as I was studying. And certain ideas that were resonating with us greatly was this concept of enabling, how to construct environments that allow and afford other people to co-author or to participate. And over the last 10 years that we've been together working, a small group of 2 people, but actually collaborating with 3 to 5 people at any one time, we've been asked to explore different ideas. Greece's first national park that was master planned by Renzo Piano. We were asked to do the lighting for it and 2 thematic landmarks. We've been working with the city of Detroit. We've been exploring certain ideas of deployable architecture by making a land art proposition in Norway outside of one of the largest fjords in the world. The work has been very much tied towards developing a kind of sensibility. I can't argue for style like Patrick can or so forth. We haven't generated a lot of projects in which that actually resonates, but we can talk about the fact that we really do believe that architecture, in a sense, is an expanded sort of space. And so if it's interfaces, if it's making large-scale participatory structures, if it's designing vehicles, if it's making constructs, our approach towards things, if it's through robotics or participation in kind of open questions like in the UK we have something called Nesta, which is the innovation department that was set up to participate in different kinds of ideas of future of democracy, future of global money. What people see in our work at times is the kind of future of what machines could be. The things that I do with Stephen are very much sort of trying to explore kind of new evolving relationships with machines. We're not really interested in kinds of ideas of production that are quite finite in terms of what robots can do. We're interested in these kind of evolving and emotive kind of relationships, behavior-based sort of strategies of thinking and interacting with things and each other. So if it's between people with other people, or if it's people with machines, or machines with machines, we're interested in the fact that things today have a certain agency, and through that agency it opens up a very different kind of territory, one that has to deal with latency and uncertainty as a primary sort of aspect. So we use installations very much as a way of exploring ideas and opening up those ideas, if it's social robotics, if it's other forms of thinking of material computation to people. Those worlds are certain forms of testing, and more recently we've been given opportunities to develop more architectural proposals, if it was reconsidering a master plan in Osaka, or if we, for the first time after 10 years, after working in offices, doing competition proposals for things like Museum of Architecture and Photography in Budapest. For us, what we're trying to work through a little bit is this notion of shifting from representation and trying to work on things in a more prototypical way. And so I think if there is something about the contemporary world is to reconsider the notion of the prototype and the role that it plays for young architects as well as old. At the same time, I think is asserting certain kinds of ideas that I think were at the heart of everything. If this is a cover of 1913 Scientific America, the vision or the promise of the city was a three-dimensional interface, buildings interconnected with other buildings, different forms of transport and mobility. If we look at what's being discussed today, this is the Transport Authority in London, who's basically commissioned artists to think about what the future vision of cities will be. So they gave the brief of 2026, and if you know the City of London, pretty much everything is the same, but we get more roller coasters, a little bit of Disneyfication. And it seems that the vision that many of us had seen, and I think great architects who were trying to wrestle with the complexities and the problems of these things, have been completely trivialized in today's conversation. Or if it's not, it's a reassertion of this idea of the generic or the boring, which, to be honest with you, I have no commitment to. I fundamentally despise these kind of words as being words that accept the fact that architecture somehow is a very passive receptacle for all of the changes that are around us. And I think if we look at the complexities of things, certain kinds of architects like Kenzo Tange was given the kind of problem and the brief to design a city as if it was a building, to design a city for 8 million people, and in a sense, it wasn't a lack of vision that kept this kind of project from moving forward, but it was really not having the capacity to deal with change. And change is very much a part of our everyday, which one could recognize. When we look at some of these speculative ideas of the city, Broadacre City from Frank Lloyd Wright, for example, you'll see in this depiction, the whole notion of mobility is very much fundamental. We'll have these flying helicopters that will be moving around, and he did design a version of a single occupancy car. In my work, I've tried to elaborate a little bit of that kind of stuff, especially in the research that I do with my students within this kind of world of an adaptive ecology, which at the heart of it is basically saying that communication is the enabling agency of all forms of interaction. And sometimes it takes its cues from the natural world, and sometimes it takes its cues from the synthetic. I'm not so privy to sort of nature as being something other more than a constructed fact as well. So if we look at stigmergy, if we look at termites, we can learn a lot of things. And I think for me, it's very important to have a kind of open and kind of curious way of where ideas can come from. And part of that is also to speculate computation today. I think computation today is in an interesting place where we're asking algorithms to do a lot of things. Some algorithms, these are very simplified ideas of machine learning, are being asked with a task to be able to understand, identify, and to respond. Some of the questions of the smart city, which Reiner was mentioning and Rem has written about, is a fair assessment that not everything is smart, and some of that stuff becomes a kind of surveillance in a way that potentially is very problematic, but doesn't necessarily mean that it shouldn't be discussed. So here, the same kind of monkey algorithm that was basically asked with the task of depict the Mona Lisa is basically operating in the world of Super Mario Brothers. The same kind of set of information in the background, operating as finding new solution spaces, but to finite problems. Within architecture, we always try to construct instruments for understanding, and Frei Otto is a very interesting character because fundamentally to his practice, he always tried to build instruments to understand what it is that he was looking at. But he was limited in his kind of depiction of things. This is a famous kind of diagram that he shows, optimized detour networks, and his idea of how this could actually be a way to reconsider the city. And with our students and in the DRL and other places, of course, we can do more complex versions of that, but I think that there is an opportunity and an attention to understand that not all of these lines fixed in that finite depiction of representation are weighted the same, and that there's a strife and a tension and a time-based kind of necessity, a fragility that is very important to somehow decipher and to sort of make legible. And I think part of that legibility is having a commitment to these things, if it's Frank Lloyd Wright and his columns, if it's Candela, but it's also a recognition that there's another part that's really operating within the world, and there is material computation, and we have a deep-rooted history, but we have a sensing technologies, and we have these other things operating in the world that have their own agency. So for example, these are 2 vacuum cleaners. The Roomba, which was designed by the head, one of the heads of basically robotics within MIT, Rodney Brooks, and on the right, the cheap version in China. Both of them coming out under your sofas, trying to understand its environment through its very limited capacity and basically trying to clean things up. When we look at all the different sort of immaterial and invisible forms of connection and understanding, this is basically the things that we send up in space to do your Google Maps and all of these other things that are driving your orientation and your capacity to see the city. When we look at machine learning beyond those kind of simplified algorithms, we start to see that there's also a collapse of space and time, which is fundamentally very different from anything that we've sort of experienced before. And maybe that was part of where I was alluding to Peter, that there is possibilities of thinking about this collapsed real-time environment that we are negotiating, which is not top-down and which is not bottom-up, but is evolving and is dynamic. And this is a kind of examples of things that we see on YouTube every day and posted around Facebook. This is the first Google car release of basically some researchers that are working and what autonomous vehicles would actually do. The volume of this is basically this guy just cursing as he is completely demystified that he has no control and has been rendered completely incapable of having some kind of action and reaction, but at the same time the car is performing in ways that actually make other things legible. The funny thing about this time period, the same people that are constructing our ideas of today are also the ones that are very suspicious of it. Suspicious maybe because it's not them. So if it's Stephen Hawking or Elon Musk or Bill Gates, they warn about these ideas of artificial intelligence. If it's Rem, he puts up a conversation in terms of smart cities being a certain attitude that potentially looks, and he uses a car as an idea, of the car being almost like a prison in which is a constant surveillance. And in a certain way, it's possible, but there's other ways of looking at it, and if we like it or not, this is happening. So in the UK, it's a pilot city for the autonomous cars. Everything from downtown to remote suburbs, these ideas of vehicles are happening. But for those that may feel a little bit scared that the future is coming and they're not really prepared, this is the DARPA challenge. DARPA, who basically bought Boston Dynamics, a very, very important kind of research laboratory for advanced robotics. DARPA sets up this challenge, which is basically allowing these kind of very humanoid-looking robots to sort of participate in the world, and as you can see, they seem to have some problems. What's interesting to me, though, is that students, as well as, let's say, uneducated within robotics, still have accessibility to it. So we develop these kind of models all the time in the studio, trying to understand basically how things could potentially communicate. If so, what do they ask? And we do try to explore ideas of projects within the urban environment, but those kind of simplified forms may look at something like parking as a problem, and think about autonomous vehicles not necessarily about a new design for a car, which every automotive company is designing, but to rethink a model of shared vehicles, and to rethink the idea of parking by looking at the vehicle, and the same mechanisms to drive the vehicle become the potential to make space-making devices and ephemeral structures that could be distributed within the city. So as I mentioned, that I think communication is at the heart of things. This idea of also not having a holistic understanding of the thing itself is very important. And it was alluded to by Carl Sims in the 90s, and it's worked on, I think, today, every day, in different research labs. So for example, this is Raffaello Di Andrea at the ETH, developing a chair that basically has a capacity to understand that is a chair. And all of the elements together try to reconstruct that chair. And now you can say that this problem is interesting or not interesting. If you took someone like Joseph Kossuth, he would make the argument from a conceptual problem, a chair is a chair is a chair, like he did in his 3 chairs. In the studio, we try to sort of work in ways where we can start to develop strategies and try to find ways of working on problems, and those problems maturing themselves into ways that we can develop prototypes, and those prototypes being ways of rethinking and structuring maybe a different form of practice. Because my time is running completely to a close, maybe I'll just finish with this one video, which basically is another research at ETH. What's interesting here is there's a drone and it's a person and they're juggling. But the drones don't need us. The drones can play with each other. And those kind of ideas of thinking about a new strategy for thinking through these things, I think is part of the contemporary discourse that we have today. So if it's drones being thought about as rethinking the way that goods are being shipped, or if it's actually delivery systems, there are different models for thinking about this, and I think at the heart of a lot of the things that we're trying to do, maybe I'll just leave this playing in the background, is really try to think about how those things can become accessible, how they can be worked on in a shared way, developed in a way where kind of collective organization is more of a design, as a way of thinking and making, and to try to give legibility of that by actually allowing these things to be co-authored. We are actually very interested in seeing and exploring these kind of worlds and ecologies where machines and people are interacting with themselves and take on board architecture as a real spatial problem for today. So with that, I thank you for your attention.